Okay, so let's get on with it. Our third speaker for this afternoon comes highly recommended by David Cruikshanks-Boyd, who is currently overseas and sends his apologies. And I'm sure you'll all forgive David after you hear from our next wonderful speaker. So far today, we've met engineers who've helped build the city, and we've learned about the boats that brought them here. And now our next speaker is going to take you on an amazing journey halfway around the world to one of the most remote islands in the world. I'm really looking forward to this next one because I've never heard of the island, I've never heard of the project, and I've never heard of the speaker. So it's all about to change, and this is what I love about these seminars. They're so educational. Our next speaker works as a technical executive with WSP and has over 20 years of experience in the design of civil engineering structures, having held roles in some of the UK and Australia's most significant infrastructure projects, including deputy lead on the Bond Street Crossrail Station in London and lead structural engineer for Parkville Station on the Melbourne Metro project. Ladies and gentlemen, prepare to travel back in time to another world with Stewart Garden.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure how to follow that introduction. And this is going to be a little bit different because we're, as we said, we're moving away from South Australia this time. But there are some commonalities. I'll continue references to ships in this presentation and some differences in that, embarrassingly for a Scottish person, this will be the first presentation today that doesn't reference Robert Burns. So the title of Richard's presentation of Mice and Men is the reference, which is a John Steinbeck novel, but is actually a Robert Burns reference to a poem. And then Mark's presentation had both a plaque mentioning Robert Burns and then the Cutty Sark, the name of the ship, comes from a Robert Burns poem. So sadly, I won't be doing that. But if you read my blog about this project, I do make several references to some of these poems. So as we said, my name is Stewart Garden. I work for WSP here in Adelaide. I'm working on a project at the moment on the island of South Georgia, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about it. I came back from South Georgia about 8 weeks ago. So to start with, this is not about the state of Georgia in the USA. It's not about the Eastern European country. South Georgia is an Antarctic island. Hopefully. Oh, there's a little animation. Sorry, I did not expect that one to happen. So South Georgia is one of the most isolated places on Earth. It's in the South Atlantic Ocean. It's about 2,000 kilometers from South America, about 1,500 kilometers from the Antarctic. Critically, it's on the southern side of what's known as the Antarctic Convergence or the polar front, which means its climate is polar, but nutrient-rich ocean currents feed its shores. So that makes it a haven for huge amounts of wildlife. It's actually a similar size to Kangaroo Island here in South Australia. It's 170 kilometers long. It's about 35 kilometers at its widest point. But its geological history means it is extremely mountainous. So the tallest mountain is nearly 3,000 meters above sea level. So if you can imagine a mountain that size on Kangaroo Island, you get a bit of an impression of how mountainous this is. And because it has this polar climate, it means it has significant amount of glaciers and permanent ice. So this is what it looks like. It's a mountainous and wild place. It's incredible to go to. And as I said, it is a haven for massive amounts of wildlife. So this is one of about 3 major king penguin breeding colonies on the island. The conservative estimate here is about 60,000 breeding pairs, but it's probably more like 100,000 breeding pairs of penguins. To be there is just an intense experience. It's noisy, it's obviously quite smelly, but there are katabatic winds coming off the glaciers that are chilling and fast. So it is like a multi-sensory experience. And the main destination for visitors on South Georgia, and the only place that really has any form of settlement, is a place called Grytviken. It was the first whaling station on the island of South Georgia, and it's now home to the South Georgia Museum. Ernest Shackleton, the explorer, died at Grytviken and he is buried in the cemetery here. And there are now almost 15,000 visitors every year who come through Grytviken, almost all of them on cruise ships that are typically doing a circle around South Georgia, the Falkland Islands, and the Antarctic. So it's a beautiful place. It's a remarkable place, but it has a dark history. And the dark history is because of this. Whaling was the major industry. And it was started in 1904 by Norwegians who were looking for new oceans to whale. From 1904 until the mid-1960s, about 175,000 whales were killed and butchered on the island of South Georgia in 5 or 6 whaling stations. The process only ended because it became uneconomic. Effectively, there weren't enough whales left in the Southern Ocean to make the industrial processing of them economical. Something like 90% of blue whales in the Southern Ocean were killed. And believe it or not, that wasn't even the first major mass slaughter, if you like, of animals on South Georgia. So before whaling, sealing almost wiped out the fur seals and elephant seals on the island. They were hunted for pelts and oil. And when whaling started, there are no trees on South Georgia, so they needed fuel to render the whale blubber. So they burnt penguins because they have high amounts of oil in them. So the island was down to around about 1,000 penguins at its worst point. So this is what's known as the flensing plan in Grytviken. This is what it looks like currently. Flensing is a Norwegian word and it means to strip. So it's the process of stripping the blubber from the whale carcass. It's the heart of the whaling station. So this is the first place that the whales were dragged out of the water. To begin with, they were just stripped for their blubber and then they disposed of the carcass in the bay just outside Grytviken, which is a pretty horrific process. And not long afterwards, the bay was full of whale bones, full of blood. You can still see many of the whale bones today. And it was actually Shackleton's ship, the Endurance Visit, that's begun to put a stop to this process because there was an ordinance passed by the British government that said you must use the whole carcass. So the process then changed a little bit. And what you can see here on the left-hand side, that ramp is where the meat was taken up and put into cookers for oil and for a bone meal guano product. In the middle is where the bones were taken up and cooked, and they were processed into bone meal. And then on the right-hand side is the blubber cookery for the majority of the whale oil. So there's still 3 whaling ships there. I promised some ships, and I have to deliver. So someone would sit at the very top in the barrel there in the Southern Ocean, a pretty horrific job. And their job was to spot whales, and then they would chase whales. They would shoot them with a harpoon gun, and then they would fill them with compressed air, plug them, and they would float them in the ocean until they were ready to come back and drag them back into port. So they were then towed in, and a motorboat picked them up, and they were winched onto land to be butchered. Interestingly, actually, one of those ships has also a life as a submarine hunter from the city of Hull in England, and there's a proposal to try and take it from South Georgia to back to Hull. So, Mark, if you're looking for a project after your current one, there's still plenty to go. The whale oil and the fuel oil were in massive tanks on the island, and just gives an idea of how remarkable what was done there. Although the process of whaling was just quite horrific, the ingenuity of establishing an industry there to make this work is quite remarkable. And one of the things here, there are stores with huge amounts of spares still on the island. They had to be able to make or repair anything that they couldn't ship out. You could only ship out during the austral summer. So they had huge amounts of rivets and bolts, plates for plate steel, and they had furnaces so that they could fabricate what they needed on the island. A lot of the repair work was done over winter. And when they finished whaling in the mid-1960s, they thought whale numbers would recover really quickly. And so they left all these spares just on the island with the expectation that in a few years' time they would be back. And of course, they never were. There was actually at Grutviken a Norwegian caretaker who was there for about another 6 or 7 years after whaling finished. And he only left the island because they stopped paying him. So, yeah, an interesting time. And there's a church there. And that church was brought over flat pack from Norway. Again, just a remarkable piece of planning and engineering ingenuity to design this, to work out everything that you need, pack it into ships and get it onto the island of South Georgia so that it could be assembled there. I guess despite this, despite the dedication to religion to put a church on South Georgia, the whalers weren't actually particularly religious and didn't really attend church very much. It ended up that they had music performances there, and they had an annual ski jumping competition where there are some cracking pictures of the inside of the church with the whalers getting presented for the winners of the ski jumping competition. So despite this dark history, South Georgia is actually a really important place. Sir David Attenborough calls it a global rarity because it's an ecosystem that's in recovery from the effects of mankind. He also says that South Georgia is one of his very favourite places on the earth and calls a visit there a life-changing experience, and I can attest to that. So the island is slowly recovering from the effects of whaling and sealing. Some of the whale species have recovered to something like 90% of their estimated pre-whaling numbers. The whales are returning to the water. So these are 2 humpbacks that were photographed by the British Antarctic Survey just outside Grutviken. And there are now, as I said, in excess of 250,000 breeding pairs of penguins on the island, recovered from 1,000. There are also about 5 million of these fur seals. So 95% of the world's population of Antarctic fur seals lives on South Georgia, and they're everywhere. There are also secondary effects on the island's flora and fauna that came from whaling. So basically, we often regard dogs as our constant companion, but rats are also our constant companion. And everywhere that we go, rats go, including South Georgia, where they came off the whaling ships and caused a fair amount of devastation because there were no rodents on the island and they're ground nesting birds. So they were driven out of the island. So the South Georgia Heritage Trust, who are a charity that have been established to look after the natural and human-built heritage of the island, they established the world's largest rat eradication program. They hired 3 helicopters over a course of several years to drop bait around the island. And one of the things that allowed this to happen was that the island is segmented by glaciers coming down to the sea. But it was actually a race against time because the glaciers are in retreat, and that retreat is being accelerated by climate change. So what would happen over time is the rats would be able to get all the way around the island instead of being segmented into small populations, because rats can't cross glaciers. That's something that you probably never need to know in your entire life, but you don't know when these things come back up. So there was a race against time because they were able to treat the island in small sections where they could poison the rats and eradicate them, and they were successful in doing that. There are now no rodents on South Georgia, and there is a very strict biosecurity program to ensure that they don't return. Similarly, Norwegians brought over reindeer for food mostly, and at the end of that, there were about 3,500 present on the island, because at the end of whaling they were effectively set free and they just bred. So they had destroyed what's known as the tussock grasses, which is a sort of native grass to that area of the world, and it provides habitat for the fur seals and for the birds. So they were all shot. And I think the average number of bullets per reindeer was something like 1.05. So if you want anything large shot, employ Norwegians. And the project I'm working on is called Commensalis. It's about this recovery of the island from the effects of our presence there. And it's a sculpture project that's been commissioned by the South Georgia Heritage Trust. And it was awarded in 2020. Sorry, these animations are not planned, but there you are, a bit of added interest. And so their brief was to create a sculpture that will set the scene for visitors to Grytviken. It'll help them interpret the past and present, and it'll celebrate the recolonisation of whales, seals, seabirds, and plant life. The commission was won by a Scottish sculptor called Michael Vizocki. He has a reasonable amount of note in his homeland. He was the first or the youngest ever artist to be made a fellow of the Royal Scottish Academy, which is one of the major art galleries in Edinburgh on the Mound, if you've ever been there. Some of his works include Assembly, which is on the left there, that an installation of 77 crosses that are on a new church in Glasgow. And perhaps most notably in the centre at the bottom is a sculpture called Guilt of Cain, which was unveiled by Archbishop Desmond Tutu around 13 years ago, and it was to commemorate the bicentenary of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. So Michael has taken inspiration from the whale oil tanks and the rivets that hold them together in Grytviken. He's likened the rivets to barnacles on whales, and he's called the sculpture Commensalis. So it comes from the Latin, which describes a relationship where neither party is harmed, and often the barnacles on whales, the barnacles survive quite happily, the whales survive quite happily, neither of them are harmed by each other's presence. And so he's trying to liken this to the relationship that we should have with the natural world. He's also taken inspiration from polar charts, which are also known as nightingale charts, in the middle at the top there. These charts were used extensively by Florence Nightingale in the Crimean War, and she used them to communicate the numbers of different types of casualties during the war, really with the intent of getting better understanding of what was killing soldiers and getting their lot in life to be improved. So he's adopted this form, and he's using the rivets recovered from one of the former whaling stations to give a unit to the numbers and different species of whales that were killed on the island. He's created 6 what he calls spirit tables, which are large structures made of weathering steel. They harken back to the rusty tanks, as I said. And he's using 6 of these to represent the 6 main species of whale that were hunted on South Georgia. There's the negative cut that you can see at the bottom on the right-hand side, and that links back to the polar chart. So it shows the species and it's linked to the numbers that were killed. And he's using stainless steel rivets that will shimmer and represent the hope of recovery. The pattern on each of these tables has a relationship to the behavior of the whale species. So this is a humpback whale table, and the humpbacks create these spiral bubble nets to corral krill. So he's recreated that behavior pattern with spirals in the stainless steel rivets. He's also used, as just a couple of other examples, sperm whales tend to form, when they're under attack, a circle around their young to protect them. So he's reflecting that pattern with the rivets. And southern right whales feed principally at night, so they have a crescent moon shape on the tables. And these are all arranged on the flensing plan, which is where the whales were dragged out of the water and butchered. So yeah, sculpture has 7 tables in total. They're all made of weathering steel. This is a model that shows the sculpture in place. They're sort of typically 5.5, 7.5 meters in diameter, and there's a small footbridge that links these. which is kind of where I become involved. So WSP is supporting this project as a pro bono work. We're providing structural engineering design for the sculpture. Foundation design. Durability is obviously a big concern, so we're providing materials and sustainability advice as well. Plus, as Mark talked about, a considerable amount of my own time is going into this, and I'm sure he'll understand what this begins to become like. I also took 6 weeks of long service leave to go to South Georgia in February. So there's no way to fly there. You can't land an airplane anywhere near it. You can't land on the sea because it's too rough. So you have to go by ship. It takes about 2.5 days from the Falkland Islands to get there by sea, and that's on the fast cruise ships. If you're unlucky to be on some of the more functional ships like the fish patrol vessels, you can be 4 days at sea before you get to South Georgia. Fortunately, the Norwegian cruise company Hurtigruten, who are just fantastic, they give us berths to get there so that we could go to the island and begin planning this. We arrived in King Haakon Bay, which is where this picture shows, and this is where Shackleton arrived in South Georgia after rowing the James Caird from Elephant Island just off the Antarctic Peninsula. It's a pretty imposing place to be. There's brooding mountains, glaciers, fur seals and penguins everywhere. And yeah, our project is currently in this investigation phase. So we're trying to work out, how do we get 7 large steel sculptures to South Georgia? What equipment have we got on the island? Which is not very much. So on the left, you can see one of the 2 JCB telehandlers that is basically all of the lifting equipment or mobile lifting equipment we have on the island. So that one's a 3-ton, and the slightly bigger one is 4 tons. So we can't lift anything bigger than 4 tons when we're on the island. How to get it there by ship, so we can lift containers off of the ship on the right-hand side, which is a fisheries patrol vessel that can lift about 20 tons. And we can get it onto the wharf, but the wharf is still 1 kilometre along a dirt track from the site of the sculpture. So there's some fairly significant logistical challenges that we need to overcome to get there. We need to recover some of the materials, some of the rivets that we're going to use. We need to understand the atmospheric corrosivity on the island, and think about how we make this sustainable. So yeah, it was probably, I have to say, the most awesome site visit I've ever done, by a fair margin. We spend a little bit of time on the left there. That is Michael, the sculptor. So for those of you who don't think artists do any work, I at the very least managed to get him to put up some sample coupons that we're using, and were donated by BlueScope Steel, so that we can measure the amount of corrosion that we encounter over the next 1 to 5 years, and make sure we've got our durability design right. Spent a bit of time studying historical land use and some of the subsurface conditions. So believe it or not, in the most remote, or one of the most remote sites in the world, there is a high voltage electrical cable right under where we want to put the sculpture. And it is the only high voltage electrical cable in the entire island. It goes from the hydropower plant to the British Antarctic Survey Station. So we've got to deal with that. If anybody doesn't believe in Murphy's Law, that surely is proof. And we spent some time talking to the small build and maintenance team that are on the island to understand their capabilities, so that we can design a sculpture that we can actually get there and build with basically a small augmentation to the skills and equipment that we've already got on the island. And there's a fair amount of wildlife, as I've already said. These are elephant seals, but they also represent probably the best ever structural load case, because there's a chance that these might climb onto the sculpture. The biggest ones weigh about 4 tons, so by the time you've got a few of them, they like to snuggle up together, even though they're more or less solitary creatures. There's something like 10 kPa underneath those for the structural engineers. So we've got a sculpture that's going to have a much heavier structure than it maybe would have in most normal circumstances. And so, yeah, what's next? So we've got a fair amount of ground and contamination investigation. We don't really know what's below ground in the flensing plan, but there's probably a fair amount of timber. There's almost certainly hydrocarbon contamination, probably from diesel fuel spills, from the motorboat that's currently sitting there, also from winches. There's obviously whale oil will be in the ground, so we've got to go through all of that. We've got to prepare an environmental impact assessment to get government approval for the project and satisfy all of their planning approvals. What seems to be a relatively simple aspect of the project, which is the structural design, we're in the process of finding fabrication and construction partners. So there are a few operators on the Falkland Islands who occasionally do some work on South Georgia, often fairly minor sort of capital works, but there's a little bit of ability to get construction crews over there. And yeah, we need to do some fundraising for this as well. So I wanted to come back to Sir David Attenborough, because I struggled a little bit with the idea of tourism to such a wild and unique place. But he puts it really well that no one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they've never experienced. And I think when you go to places like this and you see what the wild world really is like, you begin to care quite deeply about it. And I definitely have experienced this. So yeah, thank you very much. You can follow my blog on LinkedIn with the hashtag of Commensalis, and you can become a supporter at sght.org. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Stewart. That was absolutely fascinating, and I learned so much. One thing I wanted to understand a bit better was you explained quite well, like the ecosystem of the island and how it's almost like the people that went before you have done environmental engineering on the island to try and restore the natural heritage.
Yes.
What keeps the island going? Like, who lives there and what's the local economy now?
Okay, so in essence, nobody lives there. And that's one of the reasons why the natural world has recovered. There's no native population. And there never has been, because it's so remote and so cold. You can't grow very much there. There is in summer around about 30 people on the island. They are South Georgia Heritage Trust people who run the museum. The British Antarctic Survey, who are the majority, so they run a research station mostly around fisheries research. And the majority of those people are actually support crew. So they have a doctor there all the time for fairly obvious reasons, because it's 2.5 days to the nearest hospital by sea. They have boat crew there. They have maintenance, engineering people there. And there are some government officers who effectively do the passport control. So South Georgia is it's a British overseas territory. It has its own government, but because there is no population, there are no politicians. It might sound like an ideal location in that respect. But there are still some civil servants. They are based in Britain, in the Falkland Islands, and on the island itself. So yeah, in total, there are maximum of 30, 35 people on the island at summer. At the moment, in the austral winter, there are 8 people who keep the British Antarctic Survey Station, which is 1 kilometre away from Grytviken, going, and that's it. There is nobody else there. There's a very small crew at an outpost, a small island called Bird Island off the north of it. The entire economy is sustained by 2 things. Tourism, obviously, 15,000 people going through is about 40% of the revenue for the island, and the rest of it is fisheries licenses. So there is a 200 nautical mile fisheries patrol zone, which is very, very carefully managed and very strongly licensed, so that fish stocks will recover. So that is the economy: fishing, tourism. Yep.
Thanks, Stewart.
Thank you.
Happy to take questions from the audience.
there a governor of South Georgia?
There is, yes. And the governor of South Georgia is the same person effectively as the governor of the Falkland Islands. And her name, I don't remember at the moment. Sorry.
Are you competing with volunteers?
Well, I can offer a better destination than Port Adelaide, but other than that, I don't really see this as a competition. Obviously, projects are quite different, and yeah, the number of people that we can get there to do any of these things is pretty limited. So yeah, I'll compete for money though.
We have another question. I'll give you the microphone, Richard.
Oh, no, thank you for that. A fascinating insight into the broader heritage perspective. One question from your photographs. There are quite a few residual buildings there. What's the management strategy for those? And is there anything there of particular interest?
Yeah, so the management strategy is an interesting one because they're beginning to fall down, and they don't have an awful lot of money. So the fortunate thing is that because the climate is pretty cold all the time, and a lot of what is there is some pretty good quality steel. They're not falling down very fast. In fact, one of the structures that we looked at really closely is the ramp where they used to haul the meat up to the loft, to the cookery. And it has been exposed. I think there was an initial coat of paint that probably didn't last very long because they used iron chains to drag the meat up. That's been there since 1956. And effectively, there's no section loss. It's just surface corrosion on it. So they're a little bit lucky in that what remains on the island in terms of infrastructure is not going to corrode too fast. Most of the buildings that you kind of saw in some of those photographs were previously clad either with wood to begin with. It's all rotted away. There was also a lot of asbestos on the island. So it's been removed. So yeah, it's kind of a do what you can with effectively a carpenter, an electrician, a mechanic, and a plumber. And you know, they are the maintenance team, and they just manage the best they can in the summer.
Great. Well, thanks for your questions. You've been a fantastic audience. You deserve a break. You deserve a cup of tea and some food and a biscuit. Please spend the time networking, but if you could be back at your seat for the afternoon session at 3:30, that would be great. And if you could show your appreciation for Stewart once again. Thank you.